There are days when life is hard and you want to yell at everyone around you. You know the kind of days I'm talking about. You open your eyes, suddenly realizing you're running late because you hit the snooze button too many times. You rush out the door, and the rest of your day becomes an uphill struggle. My day started out that way, and by the end, it got worse. Much worse. Jillian and I had been married for just under 5 years. We met through friends at a barbecue and hit it off right away. As I learned from Jillian and her friends, she was going through a rough breakup with her longtime boyfriend. I was a pretty good-looking single guy who they thought might be good for her. I was wary at first. I didn't want to be the go-to guy. However, over the course of a few months, our mutual friends kept bringing us together, and we developed a friendship. 6 months later, I plucked up the courage to ask her out, and a little over 2 years after we met, I asked Jillian to be my wife. At the time, I was thrilled that she agreed, and until tonight, I felt like I could sell the air Jillian breathed because I loved her so much. Greg? Jillian asked me as I was polishing my shoes for our going out tonight. Should I choose black or beige-heeled shoes tonight? This is me, Gregory Other, a generally nice guy, a hard-working accountant with his own practice, and right now I feel like the biggest sucker the world has ever seen. You look good in both, I told her. But the black-heeled shoes emphasize your calves much more. They'll draw more attention. Jillian loved to dress up and looked good when she did it right. But she usually had a poor fashion sense. She just didn't know how to combine colors, styles, and shapes. That was one of the things I liked about her. She was always asking my advice, and it was up to me to make her look good. Aside from the late start to the day, it was a busy day at the office. We were doing some audits for a large multinational corporation. There were delays and incorrect information coming in. Mostly they were innocent errors, but the last few spreadsheets we audited looked wrong. My team and I spent an entire day reviewing the data and comparing ledgers. We were annoyed by some of the weird and wonderful things the managers were trying to convey to us. These included going to strip clubs and, in some cases, prostitutes. We also encountered people trying to get people to sign for cocaine as a legitimate business expense. Going through this audit, and on this particular Friday, there were a lot of spreadsheet issues. I was tired and frustrated. To make matters worse, Jillian had been happy and bubbly all week, gushing about today's reunion. It annoyed me that throughout the week, she had paid no attention to my fatigue. In the past, if I had a rough week like this one, Jillian would take the time to listen to me, sympathize with me, and usually show a little love to lift my spirits. But this week, she was so focused on the reunion event that I felt uncomfortable for the first time since we'd known each other. I can't say I liked that feeling, but she was my wife. And if she was happy about something, I tried to be happy for her, regardless of how I felt myself. Tonight was her high school reunion. It wasn't a formal event organized by the school, but rather something arranged by a few people from the class. They had rented a restaurant and then a private area in the club for the alumni and their partners. Last year I went with Jillian, and I have to admit I got a few strange looks at me after introducing me as Jillian's husband. But I had a good time. This year, I wasn't really looking forward to it. Like I said, it was a lousy week. But with my wife's enthusiasm, and as a potential escape from a difficult audit week, I showered and shaved without complaint, put on my best suit, did my hair, and labored to shake up the week to be my wife's happy helper. From the moment we arrived at the restaurant, I sensed something was wrong. Jillian was immediately dragged away by several girls from her class, and I was left standing practically alone. At dinner, we were seated with our friends, Lena and Mark, who had introduced us, and I took almost no part in the conversation, only occasionally asking questions. Jillian continued to act like a happy, simpering person, but I noticed that she rarely spoke to me, and many people, including Lena and Mark, kept throwing glances at me that couldn't be called comforting. As dinner was coming to an end, Lena and Jillian disappeared into the bathroom, and they were gone for quite some time. At the same time, everyone was breaking up to head to the club for a few more drinks and dancing. "What's going on, Mark?" I asked my friend, cautiously approaching him when Jillian and Lena didn't return after a while. "Sorry, Greg." Mark flinched slightly as I rubbed him on the shoulder. "I'm not quite sure what you mean." I threw him an incredulous look. "Mark, I swear." I stopped when I saw Lena coming back, but my wife wasn't with her. She grabbed her husband's hand, trying to avoid my gaze. "Come on, Mark!" "Lena, where's Jillian?" I asked, a note of concern in my voice. She froze for a moment, then looked at Mark. A look passed between them. Then she looked at the artificial indoor plants around the restaurant for a moment. I could see her trying to figure out how to tell me what she didn't want to say. "Sorry, Gregory. We caught up with the band and she's on her way to the club with them." "Without telling me, her husband?" I asked, a note of anger in my voice. Lena, Mark, what aren't you telling me? I asked. Neither of them met my gaze, damn. Without another word, I jumped out of the restaurant, got in my car, and drove to the club where everyone was meeting. The drive was 10 minutes, but I made it in 5. As I walked through the door, I saw her. My wife Jillian was dancing with some guy, and the way she was snuggling up to him told me it wasn't the first time this had happened. I watched my life drain out of me. People from the reunion crowded around me. No one said anything, but I could feel their pitying looks on me as I stood at the entrance to the club. I don't know how long I stood there watching them, but they didn't notice me as they danced. I stood there until I felt a hand touch my shoulder. The touch startled me, and I turned so suddenly I almost punched Lena in the face. This is Jillian's first love, Troy, Lena said, and I couldn't tell if she was happy, sad, angry, or disappointed. They practically grew up together, went to the same kindergarten, were best friends in elementary school, and dated all the way through high school. We all thought they would be together forever until he got a scholarship to a university in the States, and they broke up. Now I knew the asshole's name, knew a lot of his background. Hell, I'd helped Jillian get over the rejection she'd felt when he'd left. They don't look too shattered to me? I muttered. He's been back for a few months now, transferred to the company he works for, Lena informed me without emotion. I turned around to the dance floor. Jillian and Troy were still dancing. Lena kept talking and looking at them, and Mark was standing behind the two of us. They're meant to be together, Greg. There was emotion in her voice for the first time, like she was a doctor informing me that I had terminal cancer. I didn't say anything back. I mean, Jillian was so devastated when they broke up. She loved him so much. We never thought she'd meet anyone else. But then you met, and everything came together. Lena tried to explain, and my fists started to clench as the song stopped. We watched as Troy leaned over and wrapped his arms around my wife's face and kissed her. My fingernails dug into her palm, and blood flowed from it. When the first drop of blood fell from my palm to the ground, I thought the spell between them had broken. Jillian looked around at the people entering the club and met my gaze. With hands clasped together, she separated from Troy and made her way toward me. I hadn't noticed Mark and Lena leave. She approached me as if there was no history between us. Troy was my first love, Greg. We gave each other our virginity. Jillian told me this without any greeting. She just cut to the chase as if I was going to follow her. I stood as still as a statue. When he moved away to get his scholarship, we always said we'd reunite when he came home. I guess he moved home and you reunited, I said sarcastically, the first time I'd said those words since leaving the restaurant. Don't be like that, Jillian scolded me. I realize this is going to be hard for you, but Troy and I are meant to be together. We're meant to be together. I started and immediately stopped. Jillian Bronwyn Anaya, you married me, I exclaimed. I'll give her points for courage. She didn't look away once. I'm sorry, Greg, I really am, but we're going to have to get a divorce. I mean, Troy and I. We're going to get married and have kids. And what the hell have I been? Just your warm spot for the last few years. I was about to yell. A few people around us were staring at us, and the bouncers were looking at us, but not moving. I did, however, notice a guy in love making his way towards us. Greg, you've never been... She stopped. Look, Greg, I love you. It's just that you're not Troy, and our love is nothing compared to what Troy and I have. I watched as Troy took the last dozen steps toward us and put his arm around Jillian, a frown on his face. I take it you're Greg? He asked with a fake note of concern on his face. That's Gregory for your asshole, I replied angrily. He nodded. Okay, hostility, I get it, he said. You're upset because I'm taking your wife. She's going to divorce you, and we've been sleeping together since I got back. He paused, and the look on my face showed I wasn't guessing anything. Jillian went white as a sheet when he said it. She must have hoped it wouldn't come out. Troy didn't know me, so as soon as he realized what he'd said, he pushed Jillian behind him, adopting a defensive posture. Look, Gregory, he said, trying to sound conciliatory. I'm sorry you found out this way, but maybe it's for the best. Jillian tells me you've been a great husband, the friend I couldn't be while I was away. It would be nice if we could all be friends, since we have several groups of friends in common. Not for long, I said, holding my gaze on Jillian for a moment, and looked at Troy again. He turned pale and wanted to say something, so I spoke before he could respond. So, let me get this right, I said, removing all emotion from my voice. My anger was growing by the moment, but I kept it contained for now. Surprisingly, at that moment, the music interrupted, and my voice could be heard throughout the room. Apparently, this little show had gotten everyone's attention because everyone turned to look at us, even the DJ who never started the next song. You two believe you have true love, have fun, and then break up because Troy moves to another country. But while Jillian mourns her grief, she meets me, supposedly falls in love and marries me, and we're happy for a few years. They nod warily, and you can hear a pin drop. Then true love flares up again when Romeo returns to the country, and you two start having fun behind my back again. Obviously, all of our friends know about it, judging by the looks I've been getting all night tonight, and it all culminates in a conversation about my supposed best friend ripping my heart out and holding it high in the air for everyone here to see in one of the most humiliating ways possible. Greg, it wasn't supposed to be, Jillian started to say. It wasn't supposed to be like what? Shouted I yelled back, but no one moved. All week you've been jumping around but ignoring me. Despite my rough week, you demanded that we both attend tonight, and then you ditched me as soon as we walked in the door. You disrespected me in front of our supposed friends and even left the restaurant without talking to me so I'd catch you here. Hey! Tried to say Troy, but I stared at him. Don't say a word, Romeo, I growled. Your true love has shown she's an unfaithful whore. You say you've been having fun for the last 3 months because you're one of the true romantics. Back off. Look, Greg, Troy said, trying to get the conversation under control. I realize there's a lot of emotion around right now. But Jillian and I are meant to be together. We're sorry you got hurt and found out we slept together. But Jillian loves me, and we're going to get married. Naturally, you and she will have to divorce. Naturally, I replied indifferently. Look, Greg, Jillian said. I'm sorry, but we've decided that's the best way out. It'll be a quick rip of the Band-Aid. We know it'll hurt, but it's best for everyone. She paused, trying to gauge my mood. She may have been my wife and best friend for the past few years, but I'd always been open to her. She'd never considered me a closed book. Jillian, it's Gregory, not Greg, I replied. She gulped. Look, Gregory, she said. I know you're hurting right now, but it's for the best. We're still young. You'll find someone else. My eye twitched, and that small display of emotion made her pale even more. There was still no sound coming from the room. Troy must have noticed because he cleared his throat. Look, Gregory, I realize this isn't easy for you, but I think it's best for you to leave. Everyone here knows that Jillian and I are supposed to be together, and I unfortunately think you're going to be the third extra. I smiled, and this time half the room looked at me questioning. On that, we agree. He smiled back, thinking I might understand. Okay, now that it's out in the open, Jillian and I will stay away from your house this weekend, and even next week so you can move out. Move out? I asked, tilting my head to the side. Troy gulped. Well, it's Jillian's house. I see, I said, narrowing my eyes. Greg, Ori, my soon-to-be ex-wife said, having a hard time transitioning to using my full name after such a long hiatus. We thought it would be easier for you to move in. The house is perfect for Troy, and I to have kids, and we decided it was too big for you, so we'll figure something out. I see, I repeated to myself, with the last syllable sounding like a snake hissing. No one said anything for a while, and the silence stretched on until the DJ decided it was time to turn up the music, since there was no fight in sight. When the music started, no one started dancing. Everyone in the room continued to watch to see what would happen. Troy spoke loudly. I'm sorry, Gregory, but this is the situation. I know you may not think so now, but don't take offense. He held out his hand. I looked at his hand, then back into his eyes, and that look made him quickly pull his hand away. If he could have looked into my mind, he would have seen me chopping off that hand with the nearest sharp object and then shoving the severed limb into a certain hole. Deciding it was time to leave, I turned and walked out. No one stopped me. The two bouncers on the doors opened and stepped out in front of me. When the doors closed and the noise from inside died down, Are you okay? One of the guys asked. They too had witnessed what had happened. No, not really, but I think anyone who just got it in their hands. I blanched. You know, the other bouncer said, if you wanted to go back and give that asshole a couple punches, we could have waited a few minutes before pulling you out. For the first time all day, I laughed. Both bouncers smirked. While that's tempting, no, I don't need a night in the gatehouse. Both nodded. Still, the first bouncer said, look, I've seen some shit in my years of working in clubs, but this is one of the coldest, meanest ways to break up a marriage I've ever seen. Anyway, I'm sorry. I brushed off the sympathy with a wave of my hand. Don't worry about it. I think I'll just go home, I replied. And change the locks, buddy. Don't let that whore back in the house until you have to, the second bouncer added. I raised an eyebrow and smiled. We talked for another minute and I shook their hands before heading to my car and home. On the way home, I stopped by Bunnings Warehouse. It was getting late, and it was still an hour before closing time. But I quickly bought everything I needed. New locks and deadbolts, some moving boxes and packing tape. Once I arrived home, I got busy changing locks and assembling boxes. A few hours later, I had several boxes filled with Jillian's things before I started to feel the adrenaline of being so completely and utterly abandoned by my wife and supposed friends that I had to sit down. I poured myself a Kraken and Coke and then fired up my laptop. I opened our bank and started doing the usual things you do when you're betrayed by your spouse. I blocked and then canceled our joint credit cards. I opened a new account, then transferred half of our joint savings and vacation accounts into it. All of this would take a few days, but I had a few $100s in cash, so I could wait. As the sugar from the Coke and rum worked its way through my system, I perked up and opened our legal folder. It was full of legal documents, including the deeds to the house, the 2 investment properties we had bought, and the prenuptial agreement we had drawn up when we got married. Now I know what you're thinking. There's an adultery clause in it. No, that's where you're wrong. For the most part, the prenup protected my business assets. When we started dating and got married, I had just started my accounting business. However, after starting the business, I got a couple of good mentors who gave me wise counsel, and we formalized the business that supported my practice in my name only. And Jillian and I signed a prenuptial agreement that the other accounts, my business, and all other subsidiaries were not to be divided. Looking back now, I'm sure Jillian agreed so easily because she knew. One day she would likely betray me for her lover. But she didn't realize how much it would cost her. I fell into a restless sleep that night, but I managed to hold on for a few hours until I woke up and decided to head out for breakfast. I traveled around the area a bit and found a great Asian fusion-style establishment that mixed traditional Asian and Australian cuisine into delicious breakfast dishes that I enjoyed. While I ate and enjoyed a strong coffee, I drafted a letter to a friend at one of the law firms my company works with, outlining what was going on and preparing for the divorce proceedings. The call I received a half hour later was one of disbelief, but I laid out to Mike everything that had happened. He told me that he would be ready to file the papers on Monday morning and would refer me to someone in his firm who could help. Of course, he let me know he was sorry. I spent another hour in the cafe. I didn't really know what I was doing, other than surfing the web on my laptop and feeling a little sorry for myself. When I got home, Mark and Lena had already parked in the driveway and got out of their car when I parked on the curb. "Greg, started Lena. I raised my hand before she could continue and she stopped. "Gregory," I said. "Excuse me?" repeated Lena. "My name is Gregory. Only my friends can call me Greg," I said flatly. "Listen, buddy," Mark began, trying to sound conciliatory. "We're sorry about how last night went. It's not like—" I raised my hand again and he stopped, as did his wife. I looked at the tree on the other side of the road for a moment. It was a large tree that had had one of its limbs ripped off during the recent storm. The branch had collapsed onto the carport but hadn't hit the house. As I looked at it, I thought the analogy of a tree losing a branch fit what I was feeling just right. Losing Jillian made me feel like my arm had been cut off. When I looked back at Mark and Lena a moment later, tears were streaming down my face and anger burned white-hot in my eyes. "Don't you dare, Mark! Don't you dare make excuses!" I hissed. "You've known that slut has been cheating on me behind my back for months and you say nothing." "But Gregory, it's true," started to say Lena. "Love," I finished, interrupting her as I felt warm tears continue to flow down my face. "Spare me the sanctimonious nonsense, woman. Real love doesn't stab others in the back to get its way. Real love is compassionate. It cares about what happens to those around it, not abandoning them or humiliating them without warning and then wiping its feet on them in front of the whole crowd. I thought what Jillian and I had was true love. I never doubted her. I worshipped the ground she walked on, and I loved her so much I would have given her everything." "I know," Lena said, and tears came to her eyes. "But Jillian and Troy—" "Stop!" I shouted, my rage boiling over in that single word. My tears suddenly disappeared. "Stop," I said more quietly. "Lena, I don't want to hear another word about Jillian and Troy. I don't want to hear another word about their love and the fact that they're meant to be together. I just wasted the last few years of my life lying. 7 goddamn years of Lena. Years of having me by her side when she was struggling with identity issues, when she felt like Troy had abandoned her. Years of encouraging her to grow beyond her limits. Years of severe period pains every month and years of family planning. And let's not forget the years of talking about growing old together. I wasted years because I was only plan B. But tell me why, friend, I said, putting emphasis on the word. Why can this jerk come back and dump her while I spent years investing in a man I loved unconditionally? They looked at me like I was a child who didn't understand anything. I continued, and the pain and anguish burst out. He gets all my labors. He gets the woman I created when he abandoned her. He gets all her friends who betrayed me before she had true love. At least they had the decency to look ashamed at that last statement. Well, screw it, I exclaimed. Now she's going to get what she deserves, and you were both part of it, so get the back off my property. Greg, said Mark. I glared. Look, I get it. None of us thought this would happen. We honestly thought Jillian and you would be happy forever. We thought you'd have kids. But Troy is back, and we can all see how much they love each other. We know it sucks, but they deserve to be happy. What about me and my happiness? I asked them. What do I deserve? None of them knew what to answer. I sighed. I'll tell you what I deserve. I deserve a faithful wife. I deserve friends who care about me. But I don't get any of those things, so screw you. I don't need your pity. None of you, including this whore, seem to care about me if it conflicts with them. So if I seem bitter, it's because I am. However, put yourself in my shoes, I said. I looked at Lena. Mark, when Lena finds her true love and leaves you for him, you'll understand how I feel. But Mark is my... Mark's hand tightened on Lena's arm, silencing her. All right, Gregory, Mark said. You've made your point, and you don't want to see things from the other side. We're leaving, but as a final friendly gesture, is there anything we can do? I thought for a moment, then looked at the minivan they had parked in the driveway. Yeah, wait here. Over the next few minutes I took out, well, practically threw out several boxes of Jillian's clothes, makeup, and personal items. I tossed the boxes in front of them, and a couple times I could hear the fragile items shattering. I saw them flinch but didn't say anything. I thought about just leaving them in the driveway, but since you're here, you can just take them to the slut's new home, wherever their love nest is, said I. But Jillian said she needs a house and you're going to move, said Lena. I laughed, silencing her before she could say another word. It's not her house. It doesn't belong to her. But it doesn't belong to me either. So she'll know she's out of luck. Tell that whore she doesn't need to come back here. Everything that belongs to her is in these boxes. Also, tell her my lawyer's going to mail her divorce papers on Monday. I've already taken all her stuff and taken myself off the registry, so everything that's left belongs to her. You didn't even... Lena started and stopped. What? I asked. Fight? Hell no. She's in love with him. She cheated on me, and she's been lying to me for years about where her loyalties lie. No, I'll give her what she gets. No more, no less. There was nothing more to say, and I watched them load most of the boxes into their van and drive away. I think they were a little sad. They realized that by supporting Jillian, they had lost my friendship. But if they were remorseful, I wasn't there to see it. That night I got drunk and cried like a baby. I got angry and pounded my fist into the wall. In doing so, I broke the vase that Jillian and I had bought on vacation for our first wedding anniversary. In my rage at being abandoned by my wife and friends, I trashed almost the entire living room. If an item wasn't tied down, I threw it. If it was tied down, I used everything else to smash it to pieces. In the hallway, I punched more holes in the walls. I let the anger boiling inside of me boil over, ripping almost all the doors off the cabinets in the kitchen and even leaving a couple big dents on the refrigerator. I woke up in the morning with a hangover, a headache, bloody knuckles, possibly a broken hand, and scratches all over my arms and legs. I roughly applied a few bandages to my arms and hands, knowing that I would need to take myself to a doctor to get everything checked out. I looked around the living room, noting that I would have to replace almost everything, as not a single piece of furniture escaped my wrath. Along the hallway were unevenly spaced holes I'd made, taking out my frustration on the unsuspecting walls. In the kitchen, cabinet doors were lying all over the floor, and appliances stood in a position that could never work properly. I wrinkled my nose as I looked at the 3 large dents in the refrigerator and vaguely remembered how, at the time, hitting the metal door had given me such pleasure. In the dented refrigerator, I found orange juice that had expired just a couple days ago, so I grabbed a couple Panadol tablets and took a big gulp. After half an hour, the throbbing in the room subsided, and I moved into the living room, sat on the floor between the broken chairs, and stared at the cracked TV. The rest of the day passed like a blur. I took myself to the doctor and had my hands examined. There were hairline fractures on both arms, and they would have to be bandaged for a while to heal. I received messages from several people, including Mark and Lena, but didn't respond to any of them. I ended up going to bed that night with no idea if I had done anything that day, other than stare at the TV and go to the doctor. The next day was Monday, and I went to the office at the usual time. The first thing I did was check my email for Friday and everything that had come in over the weekend, and then got ready for a team meeting at 9 o'clock to plan everyone's activities for the week. I had a team of 15 people, and, for the most part, we worked well together. Around 8:30, my receptionist, an older woman in her 50s named Colleen, walked into the office, took one look at me, pulled out a chair, and sat down. "So bad weekend, huh?" she asked, looking at my hands and ligaments. I hadn't said a rude word to her in the 3 years we'd been working together, but when I looked at her, she sighed. "Gregory, I'm so sorry. It must have been bad. What happened?" she asked. I sighed and stared at the screen for a moment, then took my hands off the keyboard and turned to face the office administrator. "Jillian dumped me for her true love," I admitted in a very inexpressive voice. "What?" exploded Colin. "No, you're making this up. Seriously, Gregory, don't." I raised my bandaged hands, feeling my eyes watering. I shook my head. "It's true," I told her. "We had an informal reunion Friday night. It seemed like all of her classmates knew it was coming, including Mark and Lena. They all knew that Jillian and Lover had been having fun behind my back for months. They just decided to ambush me after finding out about it on Friday night." With those words, I broke down and cried. For the first time since we had met, Colleen came over to the table and hugged me. I told her how I had gotten drunk on Saturday, and in a wild rage had smashed almost all the furniture in the house, putting holes in the walls of at least half the house. I told her how I had taken myself to the doctor yesterday to get my hands bandaged, all the while nursing a century-old hangover. By the time morning came, we both tried our best to dry our eyes. Colin led everyone into our large meeting room just in time, and once everyone was seated, I walked in and sat down. "Hope everyone had a good weekend," I said, getting a few nods around the room, but everyone tried not to look at my bandages. "This week," I started to say, but Colleen interrupted me, this time raising her hand to stop us. "I'm sorry, Gregory, but I can't let that happen. After what happened to you last weekend, you can't pretend like everything is normal," Colleen stated. I hesitated for a moment, and then nodded. Colleen looked at me again. That look indicated that she wanted to bring everyone up to speed, at least in general terms. After a moment's thought, I nodded in agreement, knowing that she would only share what would be helpful. Gregory was betrayed this weekend by his wife and a few friends. Jillian had been cheating on him for the past few months and decided to leave him in one of the most heartless and disgusting ways possible, humiliating him in front of a group of people, some of whom were supposed to be his friends. Colleen paused for a moment to let him comprehend what she'd said, then focused on the one man who sat, almost hidden, at the other end of the table. "Isn't that right, James?" asked Colin. James Colson was one of our tax inspectors. He was also one of Jillian's classmates. And I realized for the first time that both he and his wife had been there Friday night, watching the scene unfold. James hadn't spoken to anyone in particular since arriving at the office, but when he saw me, he tried to be as inconspicuous as possible. When Colleen spoke, he turned pale. When she called out to him, he tried to squeeze into the chair he was sitting in while all the heads in the room turned to focus on him. He said. "James," Colleen replied in a stern, grandmotherly voice. "Were you or were you not there Friday night?" "Yes, but," James tried to say. "And did you? Or did you not know that your employer's wife was having an affair with someone in your class?" asked Colin firmly. James swallowed. "Be honest, James." James lowered his gaze to the desk in front of him. "I knew," he said very quietly. For a moment, no one said anything. The air in the room was palpable. Until today, it seemed to me that everyone in the room had each other's backs. Almost everyone in the room was bristling, angry notes directed at James. "Okay, James," Colin said after a few moments. "Now, I think you need to leave the room. I think you need to think about your future at this firm, because if we find out that you supported Jillian in any way in the events of this past weekend, you will be summarily dismissed. Do you understand?" He swallowed again, then stood up. "I understand," and tried to leave the room as quietly as possible. No one said anything. For the most part, I'd forgotten that James had been in the room on Friday. While everything was happening, I hardly noticed anyone except the protagonists who were ruining my life. I cleared my throat. "Everyone," I said, trying to bring us back to the current moment. "I'm not going to lie. My personal life sucks, and you can all guess that my weekend wasn't pleasant. I held up my hands to emphasize that. But we all have work to do and clients to take care of. This week, I'm just going to trust that you all have each other's backs, and if you need anything specific, let Colleen know. I'll be here, but if we all get real about what's going on, I'll be confused. So please bear with me. I nearly cried again as everyone in the room began to express sympathy and words of encouragement. One last thing, I said. It's hard for me to say this, but don't crucify James just yet. I realize you're all angry, and James is an easy scapegoat. But let's take some time and get the whole story before we execute one of our own. Everyone muttered, but agreed. Colleen ran the rest of the meeting for me. Then, breaking off the meeting, I went back to my office and stared out the window. A few minutes later, Colleen knocked. Turning to the door, I saw her standing there waiting, with a very grounded James standing right behind her. I invited them in, and James obediently closed the door behind him before taking the seat Colleen pointed out to him. "I think you and James need to talk, Gregory," she said simply. I nodded, settling into my chair while James sat down on the other side of my desk. I continued to stare out the window of my office, a maelstrom of emotions still swirling in my head. It wasn't even 10 o'clock in the morning yet, and I was already looking forward to a drink. James cleared his throat. I shifted my gaze to him, and he lowered his eyes. "So," I said, an accusation in my voice. "Gregory, He stopped, and then laughed for a moment. "Something funny?" asked Colleen with a hint of anger lurking beneath her usual professional manner. James smiled at me, but it was an unhappy smile, sad and full of sorrow. "No, there's nothing funny about this whole situation," James lamented. "My boss has been betrayed, and in addition to my wife yelling at me all day yesterday, I'm about to lose my job. So no, there's nothing funny, but I'm either laughing with gallows humor or crying." I smiled cautiously at the guy. I had always liked James. He was a hard worker, and until this morning when Colleen brought him to my attention, I thought he would stay with us forever. I smiled back. "James, why don't you start at the beginning?" I asked, trying to sound casual and supportive. He nodded, awkwardly adjusting himself in the chair he was sitting in. "I assume you've heard many times about how perfect Jillian and Troy were together in high school?" he asked. I nodded. "Over the past few days, I haven't heard anything but," I replied. He nodded. "I was always a math major in school. I wasn't bullied, but I wasn't in the popular crowd either. However, we all followed Jillian and Troy. They were the king and queen of our year." James looked at me looking for a reaction. "Receiving none," he continued. "When final year was coming to an end and university places became known, we all thought they would go together, but the whole school was shocked when Troy announced he was going abroad without Jillian." He paused again. I nodded. I knew something of the story, and with a wordless gesture, I asked him to continue. "They broke up a week before graduation. Troy went to a few parties, but Jillian never went. I saw Jillian twice during the break between graduating high school and going to university. She seemed broken and withdrawn. Then a few months later, I found out from someone that Troy was living in the States. He had a full scholarship thanks to his family, and there was gossip that he already had a girlfriend." I nodded again. I had also heard it from Jillian when I had helped her get back on her feet while dating. She had cried into my shoulder a few times in the early days about how hurt she was that Troy had dumped her and gotten himself another girl. It was after one of those conversations that Jillian and I kissed for the first time, and I asked her out. After that, Troy became a distant memory to Jillian. That's how it was until recently," James continued, bringing me out of my memories. "I went to university, got my degree, met and married Sherry, and was lucky enough to get a job here." His smile was a little bittersweet. "I was surprised when I found out you married Jillian," James admitted. "To be honest, I was pleased to see how happy she was with you. After all, Troy leaving caused her so much pain, and the fact that she met a good man to help her get back on her feet made me happy at that moment." For a moment, James sank into his thoughts, and I intervened. "So when did you find out about Troy and Jillian's affair?" I asked, surprised at the neutral tone of my voice. I think James was surprised too, as he looked at me a little strangely, but there was no hostility in it. "About an hour before Jillian and you showed up for dinner," he said dejectedly. "A few people from the class were talking. I caught something about Jillian leaving you for Troy that evening, and my surprise was reflected on everyone's faces." I threw James a questioning look. He sighed. "Before dinner, only a few people knew what had happened, but everyone in the class was told that Jillian and Troy had to be together. Mark and Lena took Sherry and I aside and said that's what happened, And while they feel sorry for you, Jillian made her choice, and you're just not a part of her future. I started to object, and then Mark remembered that I worked for you. He explicitly told me that if I said anything to you, I would regret it. He said it would be best if Sherry and I left if I couldn't keep my mouth shut. I looked at James. The guy was really hurting remembering that conversation. I saw an embarrassed blush run down his neck and wondered if his eyes were moist. Sorry, Gregory, we couldn't stay for dinner. Sherry wanted us to stay. She wanted us to be there for you. But Mark and a few of the guys actually escorted us out, telling us to stay away. James, I started to say, feeling guilty in front of the guy. He raised his hand to stop me. I'm sorry, Gregory. I need to finish this. I promised Sherry. I nodded again. I have to admit I was stunned, he continued. I had just been banished from the reunion because your wife was going to betray you, and I was made a fool of. Sherry and I didn't know what to do, so we went straight to the club. Once again, we both agreed that we wanted to be there for you. What happened? I asked, tilting my head to the side. I didn't see you there? We were there. By the time you got there, though, we were already standing in the back. A few guys kept us from getting through to you until Jillian told you. When you left, they let us go after a few minutes. Sherry and I ran after you, but by the time we got to the exit, you were gone. We probably stood in front of the club for about a half hour, stunned but not sure what to do. Eventually, Sherry convinced me that we should go back inside and see what was going on. James paused, looking at me and trying to figure out how much more to tell. I nodded my head at him again and he gulped. When Sherry and I got back to the house, we were persona non grata to a little over half the class. The other half were disgusted, and when it got to them that I was working for you, they kind of surrounded us and wouldn't let anyone near us for the rest of the evening. And I started, but couldn't finish. They danced and drank without a care in the world, James said, swallowing, though I noticed his mouth was dry. I'm sorry, Gregory, but they acted like you were nothing. The few scraps of conversation that reached us said that this had been planned for months. It was even worse when the gossip columnist said that Jillian and Troy were planning to get married as soon as they could. James looked at the ground. He clenched his hands in his lap. We didn't sleep well at home that night. Sherry and I ended up fighting over everything last night, even though we were both repulsed by Jillian and Troy's behavior. That eventually led us to this morning and this, James said, pulling a piece of paper out of his notebook and placing it on the table in front of me. What's this? I asked, taking the piece of paper and quickly reading the words. My letter of resignation, he said with defeat. I noted that it was signed and dated yesterday. James, I began. No, Gregory, he replied. It's wrong what they did to you, and I couldn't help you, even though you were a great boss and, dare I say it, a friend. You deserve better than that. Sherry and I agreed that I'd rather resign than have you see what happened to you Friday night every time you look at me. For a moment, we were silent. I looked at his resignation letter again and laughed. Well, it was more like a bark than a laugh. But for the first time, I felt something other than sadness and anger. Colin and James looked at me. I pinched the page in the middle along the long edge and tore it in two. Your resignation is rejected, I said. Behind us, I saw Colin smile. James looked shocked. But Gregory, what? Why? He tried to say. James, first of all, my friends call me Greg. Given what you just told me, I'd like you to consider me a friend. You tried to help and tried to warn me, but you couldn't. They were ready to take you in. But you're here and you're sacrificing yourself because you sympathize with me. If that's not a friend, nothing is a friend. James, I'm hurt beyond belief, I explained. I'm depressed and there's a rage burning inside me demanding justice. But I'm not blind. From what you've just told us, I can see that you're upset too. James nodded. Sherry and I decided it was for the best. I know, I replied. And that's one of the reasons I want Sherry and you to stay with us. For the next half hour we talked. Eventually, Colleen, James, and I walked out of my office, calling everyone back into the conference room. I explained that James had been blindsided almost as much as I had been, and had been ejected from his own meeting because of the two rogues. As I explained what had happened and what I wanted everyone to do, any animosity towards James disappeared, and by the time we all walked out there were sly smiles on everyone's faces. The rest of the week I spent almost all of my time in the office. However, in addition to counseling my staff on what they needed to do, I spent more time spinning the wheels of my divorce. In the end, I didn't end up mailing the divorce. Jillian filed it at work. It didn't matter, as adultery is not a mandatory factor in divorce in Australia. I still made sure that my lawyers, Mike and his assistant Sally, clearly included the adultery statement in the legal documents. After she received the paperwork, I received several calls and text messages from Jillian, which I did not delete but immediately ignored. I assumed they would be angry messages, so I let them build up in my phone. I got busy managing bank accounts, listing assets, checking canceled cards, insurance, and that sort of thing. My team handled the legal paperwork and made sure everything was in order, and Jillian couldn't touch anything. Colleen didn't fail to stop by my house on Tuesday night, and more than once marveled at the devastation in my home. The tears she cried as she went from room to room could have left a trail for Hansel and Gretel to follow. On Wednesday morning, Colleen contacted my insurance agency and began organizing a damage assessment. I don't know how she did it, but by Friday she was able to arrange for the appraisers and crews to clean my house. It was all supposed to start the following week. By Friday night, I was exhausted both physically and mentally. But I still didn't sleep well, so on Saturday morning, when there was no work to do, I got up early and went for a run. I ended up running to our local stores and sat in a cafe, where I happily drank coffee and ate a croissant before jogging home a couple hours later. Back at the house, I was surprised to find Jillian sitting on the steps waiting for me. I hadn't seen her since that Friday when she left me. She was dressed casually, jeans, sneakers, and a plain blouse. But the shirt and shoes were mismatched. It looked like her lover hadn't helped her with her appearance. I stopped halfway up the driveway, and as I pulled out my headphones, I felt a thin sheen of sweat on my body. While I didn't drown out the loud music, the sounds of Anti-Sleep by Blue Stahli were coming out of them. If you ever want some music to help you deal with rage, check it out here. For a while, neither of us said anything. "Greg, it's good to see you," began Jillian. I suddenly spit out a ball of phlegm onto the grass, stopping her half-heartedly. "What?" I replied, pausing for a moment. "Are you surprised that I'm taking care of myself after my whore wife betrayed me in front of a whole group of people? Afraid I'd kill myself because you ripped my heart out without warning? Afraid I might lie in a puddle of my own vomit, drunk because you screwed me up so badly I couldn't function?" I stared at her, and Jillian had the decency to take a half step back and pale slightly. "It wasn't like that, Greg. I never meant to. Hurt me!" I almost yelled at her, interrupting the usual cheater's excuses. She was silent for a moment, then just nodded her head. "Like I damn believe that, Jillian. You purposely, and I mean purposely, lined things up to very specifically tell me that you were leaving me in front of people I thought were friends. You purposely set out to destroy me." She looked down at her feet. "Greg, it wasn't my idea to do it that way," she said quietly. "Mark and Troy thought that if we did it this way, you wouldn't try to resist." I threw my head back and laughed. "You've got to be kidding me," I said bitterly, sitting back down comfortably. "I mean, we've known each other for years, soon to be married for 5 years, and you think that when I find out you're running from me or about to leave me, I'm going to try to fight for you?" Jillian blushed. "But—" "No buts, bitch," I hissed at her. "You gave up any demand for my attention or protection the moment you spread your legs for that asshole. It just took me a while to find out about it. However, now it's out in the open and you can back off." "Greg, you can't talk to me like that. I'm still your wife after all," replied Jillian, anger rising in her voice. "Ha," I said, walking up the driveway again and past her to the front door. I pulled out my keys and unlocked the door. When I walked in, Jillian was about to follow me in, but I held up my hand and stopped her. "You're not invited," I told her without ceremony. "But, Greg, this is still my house too," she hissed. I shook my head. "No, it isn't. And it never was. The house belongs to a trust, and my paycheck paid rent to the trust every month." She looked at me incomprehensively. "Look, Jillian, this isn't your house anymore. You don't live here. But wait, I have a few things for you." And I closed the door behind her. Walking into my office, I sent a quick text to my lawyer to let her know Jillian was here. I grabbed a few things and went back to the front door. Jillian was still standing there. "Greg, she began. I raised my hand in the universal sign for "shut your goddamn mouth." "First of all, this is Gregory. I told you that only my friends can call me Greg, and you're definitely not a friend." Jillian gulped. "Second," I said, holding out a small folder to her. "Here's a check for your half of our marital assets." Her eyes widened. The impact of the check she suddenly held in her hand told her more than the divorce papers we'd already gone through. "Third, I'm told you have something for me?" She looked unsure for a moment, then opened her purse, pulled out a manila envelope and held it out to me. "I'm sorry, Greg. I mean Gregory." "You will be," I said cryptically. I opened the envelope as she stood beside me and flipped through the first few pages. I snorted and looked up at her. Jillian blushed as she realized I was reading that in return for my divorce filing, she wanted 75% of our savings and 50% of my business. I flipped back a page and came across the next document, a restraining order that would go into effect on Monday and prohibit me from leaving the house or being within 100 meters of Jillian or Troy. Really? I asked, raising my eyebrows. She couldn't look me in the eye at that moment. She knew everyone had gone too far. To be honest, Jillian had always gone with the flow. Now she was going to be in a lot more pain than she could have ever imagined. I pulled out my phone and called my divorce attorney. I stood and looked at Jillian, who was scrambling to the ground with her feet. Sally, Mike's assistant and my now divorce attorney, picked up the phone on the second ring. Hi, Sally. I have Jillian standing in front of me, in front of my house, and in addition to demanding that I respond to the divorce petition, she's charging me with a restraining order that, in addition to telling me to stay away from her and that asshole, includes my house, which she no longer lives in. Listening to Sally swear like a sailor, I watched Jillian turn several shades of red as she clearly heard the swearing on the other end of the line. Sally would sort it out and tell me what to do. So, I said, turning to Jillian as I hung up the phone, how does it feel to be one of the most disgusting human beings on the planet, Jillian? She was silent for a moment. It's not like that, Greg. Ori, Jillian replied quietly. I convinced Troy that we should give you until Monday to move out so we can move in. I laughed. You can't move out. It's not your house, said I, confirming the fact. But you can't be here, she replied somewhat irritably, like a 5-year-old who didn't get her way. I shrugged my shoulders. Perhaps, and believe me, that nasty trick won't go amiss. But just because I can't be here doesn't mean you and that bastard can be. I think it's time for you to leave Jillian. I'd wish you well, but that would be a lie. Do you hate me that much? She asked, looking at my bandaged hands but not asking the question. Do you seriously have the nerve to ask me that after you did what you did, and now you're handing me this paperwork? I answered her like she was the dumbest person on the planet. At this point, I wasn't sure if she was out of the contest. She waited without saying anything. Jillian, you were my everything. You were my best friend. There was no one in this world I trusted more than you. And then in one fell swoop, you ripped it all away from me and treated me no better than the gum you scrape off your shoe. In my eyes, you've become a damn piece of shit. So tell me, oh wisest, at what point, in doing this to me and snatching my life from me, did you think my love wouldn't turn into instant anger and hatred for you? I folded my bandaged arms across my chest. Jillian's eyes widened at the fact that I'd uttered the C word. She'd never heard me utter that swear word before, but for me to use it in a direct verbal tirade addressed solely to her. She scrutinized her hands for a few moments, and then looked up at me. I was hoping... She paused and took a breath. Gregory, you're right. We've had many good years together. But the restraining order is only in effect until the divorce is finalized and things settle down. Mark, Lena, myself, and even Troy hope that someday we can be friends when things settle down. I roared and exploded. Friends! She jerked back as my damaged hands dropped the envelope and moved expressively. You've got to be kidding me. Friends! I hissed. If any of you were on fire, I'd drink a gallon of gasoline to piss on you and make sure you burn to a crisp. Freaking friends! You're a delusional bitch, I exclaimed again, noticing movement behind her. Mark and Lena were coming up the road quickly, and I saw the asshole himself standing on the side of the road. It looked like they had gotten out of a big truck on the other side of the street when I blew up on Jillian. Oh, look! There's our friends! I hissed, looking at them. Greg! Mark said, coming up behind Jillian. Calm down, buddy. You don't need to... Back off, asshole, I answered him. We're not buddies or friends or even damn friendly partners anymore. Your betrayal is almost as bad as that whore's betrayal, so don't think you have anything to say that's going to help here. I glared at the couple who'd set Jillian and I up and then actually participated in our destruction. You both have blood on your hands, and you're just as guilty as that whore and that asshole over there. I gestured at the asshole who had stolen my wife, but who didn't even have the guts to walk up to the entryway and defend her. Greg, said Lena, trying to speak firmly. My gaze and fury turned to her. Don't you dare, Lena. You have no moral fiber whatsoever. You actively helped my wife cheat on me, both of you, I said, gesturing to Lena and Mark. You both helped set up that scene at the club to cause me maximum humiliation. They stopped and stood up. I saw Lena start to open her mouth, but I interrupted her. And don't you dare give me any bullshit about true love. You already tried that last time. Don't forget that you both introduced me to that slut, and pushed me to date and marry her. And then you both betrayed me so easily without a second thought. If you think that's what love is, then burn this damn world to ashes, because there's no hope for society if either of you are an example." They looked at me, surprised by the drool flying off my face. I stopped, and then a light bulb came on. "Lena, tell me, will you forgive Mark after he comes home smelling of perfume after spending all night at a strip club?" I smiled, my tone losing its anger and taking on a condescending tone. Lena stopped, eyes wide, and then looked at Mark. "Baby, that's not true," tried Mark to say. I laughed and they all looked at me. "No, it's not true. Mark likes to tell the story with the boys that only the front room is the clubhouse. For an extra 500, you can get a special lap dance in the back room." I watched with satisfaction as Mark started to object, but Lena sensed the truth. "Or so he tells us during the golf game." I finished, crossing my arms across my chest again, satisfied with my own pain. Mark took a step back, and a moment later he was running down the road with his wife chasing after him and yelling after him. I looked at Troy. He was staring at the jerk in surprise. Then at Jillian, a smug grin on my face. "Greg," I purred when she said my name. "I mean, Gregory, you didn't have to do that," she said. I grinned and leaned forward. "Don't worry, Jillian." I watched as she perked up her ears, and sure enough, a shiver of worry ran down her spine when I said her name. This is only the first salvo. Mark still has a lot of secrets. And in this story, Mark and Lena will only get a fraction of my wrath. I'll save the rest for those who feign true love. I smiled at her, seeing how this time she physically flinched as my words penetrated her selfish mind. What? What do you mean?" Jillian asked. "Go away, Jillian," I said, changing the subject and not directly addressing her statement. "Tell Troy to come get you. Run away, preferably out of this country with you. Because if you don't, neither you nor he will like what comes next." "Greg, what's wrong with you? Where is the man I love?" she asked, not realizing what she was saying until it was too late. "He's dead. You ripped my heart and soul out of me, and the whole left has spawned something new, something dark and something that will enjoy whatever comes." At this point, she didn't know what to say. I took a dramatic step back and slammed the door shut, letting out one of those chuckles that bad guys in movies always make. 10 minutes later, I looked outside, but Jillian, along with Troy and the truck, were gone. I sat down on the floor, my limbs shaking from the confrontation I'd experienced, and broke down again. I loved her, but I hated her. I wanted to see her broken and remorseful, regretting that she had betrayed me. I sat on the ground and cried for what we once had. I still wanted her to come back, to apologize, to use all the cliches about cheating and come back into my life. Of course, I knew that wasn't going to happen, and even if it did, I would never again be able to accept a single caress without question. The next month was filled with the usual stuff: lawyers, financial disclosures, and figuring out who gets what in a divorce. At work, the staff rallied around me. Colin helped me find a counselor. I met with him twice a week to start working through my feelings. I moved into an apartment for a short time. This was actually a good thing since I couldn't be in a house. Colleen worked with cleaning and construction crews to clear the house of broken furniture and appliances and then repair the damage. Despite her initial statement that she wanted a clean partition, Jillian ended up wanting to fight about a lot of things. First and foremost was our bank accounts. We only had $20,000 divided between 3 accounts, and she claimed that more than 15 of it belonged to her. Next was the house and investment properties. When we married, I already had a house we lived in. I was just too invested in the business. But over the years, we became convinced that was a smart move, quickly paid off the additional loan, and made some investments to purchase 2 more properties. She contributed to some improvements over the years, but all 3 homes were owned by a trust in which neither of us was a direct beneficiary. She tried to fight this with the help of lawyers, who I assume were paid by her lover. But it was all to no avail. All the properties were unavailable to her, and I smiled that she had lost the opportunity to get any return on that investment. Then came the turn of furniture and jewelry. Through my attorney, I learned that all of her belongings were packed in boxes that had been delivered to her. I provided a list, including the shoes, earrings, and necklaces that were in the boxes I had packed for her. My final thought was that Jillian was claiming half of my business, citing that she felt she was owed half since we had been together right after I opened the business. Sally angrily laid out the terms of the prenuptial agreement and even managed to give Jillian a moral lecture, claiming that she got nothing from other accounting. She ended up with $10,000, and I'd say she spent most of that amount on lawyers. I wasn't happy, but it gave me some satisfaction that she walked away with so little, and I got to keep my houses and my business, which were worth considerably more. In addition, Sally had somehow gotten Jillian to give up her wedding and engagement rings. The restraining order was lifted because Jillian had no rights to the house. As it was, she couldn't get into the house since the locks had been changed, and I had a security company drive by the house a couple times a week before moving back in. Once the final terms were set, we only had to wait a couple months for the divorce to become final. There was no word from Jillian. However, James and Sherry had gotten a lot of questions from those they were still socializing with at the reunion, and they both firmly asked everyone to back off. James learned that Jillian and her lover were living in an apartment in town provided by the company he works for. He had rented it for 6 months and then had to either pay for it himself or find another place to live. Putting two and two together, he decided that by getting together with Jillian, he would get a house ready. Too bad, asshole. The next surprise came in August. We were a couple weeks away from the final divorce, and it was tax season in Australia. Accountants have some busy periods throughout the year. For small businesses, August and September are the busiest as they want to get their taxes and refunds done as quickly as possible. We haven't done a lot of small business taxes, but we have done some services for friends over the years. I was surprised to see one of these entrepreneurs waiting for me on Tuesday morning. I never thought I would see their faces. Gregory, come on, you have to help me, pleaded Mark, sitting at a table in one of our meeting rooms. Lena sat next to him, eyes downcast. At a glance, I realized that their relationship was quite strained, which I assumed was a result of our last meeting. Why? I asked, savoring their discomfort. Sitting next to me was James. James and I had spent the last few years doing taxes for Mark's import-export business. It was a tough job, making sure the returns were filled out correctly, offsetting and reducing income. We were paid well for it, and Mark could have gone to another firm, of course, but it would have cost him a lot more, and it would have taken a few years for another accounting firm to recognize his business. Really? Are you really going to make me beg for Greg Ori? Said Mark. His voice was pleading. I laughed. James smiled. Begging would be nice, but ultimately futile. I'm wondering why you're here. After all, you all planned to humiliate me. You made excuses and didn't care about my feelings, while you all cooed and made love noises to Jillian and asshole, telling me to get a grip. Well, I got over myself and decided I wanted nothing to do with any of you. You can't believe that choice? For a minute, no one said anything. You know, you were right, Lena said quietly when no one said anything. I raised an eyebrow in response to her words. What do you mean? I asked. Lena looked at Mark for a moment. A shadow passed across her face. I was surprised at the anger, but then it passed, replaced by sadness. Mark lowered his gaze to his hands, saying nothing. About the strip club, the back room, you were right, she said sadly. A look of surprise must have been reflected on my face. When Mark bragged about it, I thought he was just exaggerating the story, being a storyteller. When I told Lena about what Mark had said, I did it to hurt them. I didn't think it was real. Wow, really? So Mark was telling the truth? I asked my former friend a little incredulously. He looked up at me for a moment, then lowered his head and nodded. I looked at Lena, raising an eyebrow. You were right, Gregory, and not just about Mark's behavior, she said to James and me, while Mark continued to lower his head. You were right about everything. We were so caught up in the romance that Troy and Jillian were putting us through that we didn't even think about you. I was about to reply, but Lena shook her head. For the first time, I held my tongue. The day you told us about Mark, for a few seconds I thought you were just trying to upset us. But then I saw the look in his eyes and realized you were telling the truth. But you didn't know it was true, did you? Asked Lena. I shook my head and snorted. Gee. She paused, then looked at me, and I was surprised to see sadness in her eyes, and directed at me. I think we all knew you were going to hurt Gregory. When he came back and then a few others told us about it, we all knew it was wrong, but buried ourselves in the illusion that it was true love and lied to ourselves that it was right. It turned out that some of those who spoke out more harshly, like my husband, she said bitterly, they soothed their consciences by telling the rest of us that everything would be okay to cover up their own cheating. I looked at the broken couple. Mark couldn't look either of us in the eye, and Lena was on the verge of a breakdown. So what now? I asked simply. Lena grinned bitterly. Now, let's just say our crows have flown home. We've hurt those we loved, and my own marriage hangs in the balance. I don't know if it will survive. I looked at Mark, who didn't say anything. I knew he was listening, but he couldn't lift his head. If this was guilt they were trying to use to make me feel sorry for them, they were wrong. I can't say I'm not pleased to hear that you're both suffering, I said softly. However, the fact remains that as the managing partner of other accounting, I have made the decision, based on the activity over the past few months, that it is not in the best interest of this business to continue to take care of your company. I saw Mark's shoulders slump. However, I said, Mark looked at me with something resembling hope. I am not without mercy. Although you don't deserve it, I can recommend 3 firms that will willingly take on your account. James has a list of their credentials. James held out a sheet of paper across the table. If you're interested, just let James know, and we can send any of them your financial statements from previous years. The sudden hope in Mark's eyes was replaced by a dumbfounded look. That's it? Asked Mark. A recommendation! Are you really done with us? Yes, I replied, shrugging my shoulders. You chose to ruin my marriage by supporting Jillian and that asshole, shamelessly using terms like true love and should be together. You even smiled, laughed, and joked while doing it. That's cause and effect, cause and effect. With those words, I got up and left the room without saying goodbye. A little later, James came in and informed me that they had chosen someone, and he would relay the details in a couple days when Mark and Lena had signed the necessary forms. Over the next month, the same scene repeated itself 3 more times with 3 more clients, Jillian's classmates, who supported her in her infidelity and realized that I would no longer do business with them. Amazingly, although I lost 4 clients, I gained 6 more. Other people in the class who in no way supported what had happened and wanted to make me feel good by bringing me on board. Not that other accounting needed the work, but I didn't turn it down. August turned into September, and the final decision to divorce came. By this time, I had moved back into the renovated house. My hands were fully healed and no longer itched. I could admit to myself that I missed looking like a boxer, but I didn't miss the itch from the bandages. The day I got the paperwork, I got a call from Jillian that I didn't call back, and I got a text message that I did read. It read, "Goodbye, Gregory. I'm sorry." I wasn't sure how I felt. Did she feel remorse for what she had done? In the months since the incident at the club, the pain of the betrayal had subsided a bit. Of course, I was still angry and upset, but I had a logical mindset, and if Jillian could so easily have an affair and leave me, then she wasn't the one for me. That weekend, Colleen and a few team members from work got together and uninvited came over to my place for a family barbecue. I was surprised, to say the least, but I hugged probably over 24 people over the course of Saturday afternoon, and only met a third of everyone there. All afternoon, I was never alone. There was always someone there, be it Colleen, James, Sherry, or any of a dozen of my staff. At one point, I was sitting with a drink in one hand as James manned the barbecue. Sherry sat with me, and I was just about crying watching a group of small kids playing a game of touch footy in my backyard. I knew now that Jillian and I weren't going to have the children we had talked about for the past few years, and watching them hurt me deeply. I felt soft lips on my cheek and looked at Sherry in surprise as she sat down next to me again. She took my hand and touched my cheek. I understand, Greg, but life will happen again, you'll see. Don't shut yourself off. You'll have the support of many people you know and strangers this afternoon. Friends, co-workers, family, and everyone here knows we are here to support you. What they did to you was unfair. They hurt both James and me, but it only echoes, so we need you to know that we're here for you. Sherry hugged me for a few minutes as I knew I was crying. A moment later, I felt a hand on my shoulder, and James was there too, a look of compassion on his face. This was followed by another hug from Colleen and a few other staff members. A few times I felt stares or soft touches on me, letting me know I was supported. However, I was pretty much a wreck for most of the day. But not once did I feel uncomfortable. The following week at work, I felt much better. The staff noticed that I was smiling and even exchanged a few jokes, which hadn't happened in quite some time. At the weekly staff meeting, I thanked everyone for coming in and helping me, naming James and Colleen, and giving special mention to Sherry for showing me that there is life even after betrayal. We also had 3 new clients that week, 2 of them very large corporations. It turned out that we were recommended by one of our old clients. The corporation needed an external, in-depth financial analysis, and we were recommended. We divided up the workload, and for the first time since Jillian left me, I decided to do a forensic audit of one of the companies. It was a good job, we had a 3-month window to get results, and we took it on. In the evenings, I got into a routine of cooking dinner and working out. I knew I could quit my job or worse, drink, but I wanted to rise above the betrayal and find life again. Thanks to Colleen and the staff at the center, I had hope of becoming more than just another divorce statistic. It was Thursday night, 2 weeks after the barbecue. I was cooking myself a quiet dinner of lamb cutlets and gnocchi with apple mustard sauce when the doorbell rang. Having just finished cooking, I threw the tea towel I was using on the table and went to the front door. When I opened the door, I was stunned. There stood a beautiful blonde woman just over 5 feet tall. She looked nervous, but before I could greet her and ask how I could help, she stepped towards me, pulled me down by my shirt, and kissed me. For a moment, I was shocked, but her lips were soft and supple. I could taste the mint in her breath, and before I knew it, I was already kissing her back. Her arms wrapped around my waist, and I pulled her to me without thinking, our lips never parting. It may have lasted 30 seconds or 30 minutes. I have no idea how long we kissed, but I know it felt amazing. When we parted, I looked into the face of the stranger I had just kissed and was surprised to find a trace of tears in her eyes. Before I could say hello, however, she pulled back and slapped my face. Not hard, it was more of a gesture, but it was a slap nonetheless. I stood there in shock, and I know it was reflected on my face. The woman's face was mournful, but at the same time full of compassion. "I'm sorry, Gregory. That wasn't the best way to say hello," the woman said. Her voice sounded sultry, yet firm and demanding, like a young Helen Mirren. I tilted my head to the side, looking at her and wondering who she was. "Sure," I said, leaving the question unanswered. The woman smiled. "Rebecca," she said simply. "Rebecca," I repeated. For a moment, neither of us said anything. "So, Rebecca," I said, looking at her questioningly, "what brings you to me tonight?" She smiled wryly. "You," she said simply. "I suppose I should have guessed that from your greeting. But why did you come to see me?" I asked, smiling with the corners of my lips. She looked like a little kitten playing with a new toy. "Because you need me to be here," she replied, smiling as well. "True," I replied. "So tell me why I need you?" I mean, I enjoy kissing a beautiful woman as much as any other man, but to follow it up with a slap on the wrist when I have no idea how I insulted such a gorgeous creature after such a kiss is baffling to me. Now I saw the amusement in her eyes. "Do you think I'm beautiful?" she asked. I nodded. "And gorgeous," I added, repeating my words. A smile spread across Rebecca's face, and I was blown away by a woman I'd known for less than 5 minutes. "Thank you, Gregory," she said, then blushed and lowered her eyes. "Does something smell nice?" she asked, sniffing the air. I sighed contentedly and opened the door, inviting the strange woman who had apparently come for me into the house. I was sure she was harmless, and I was curious as to what she wanted. We talked for a bit about nothing while I escorted her into the kitchen, pulled out a glass, looked at her, and then poured her a nice Shiraz that I had recently been drinking. Setting the glass in front of her, I watched as she raised a neatly manicured eyebrow, went back into the kitchen, and finished cooking dinner. Luckily, I was making leftovers for lunch the next day at the office, so I quickly grabbed a second plate and prepared the food for Rebecca. She watched me cook, holding her wine but not sipping it. I placed a plate in front of her, one on the seat next to her, and returned with the cutlery and my own glass of wine, but only after I dimmed the kitchen lights. Rebecca giggled as the light in the room diminished. "Our first date? And you ordered for me?" she asked casually. "Well, a woman likes a man who knows what he wants," I replied. Rebecca threw her head back and laughed. Then she looked me in the eye and raised her glass. "To Gregory, friend, showing that even wounded he still knows how to treat a lady," she said as she raised a toast to me. We clinked glasses and sipped our wine with a smile. I let Rebecca taste the dish first, and as she cut off a decent piece of meat and dipped it in the sauce, I saw her eyes widen. "Gregory, this is amazing, thank you." I nodded and did the same. It was delicious. I got the sweet and sour flavor of the sauce just right, and it seemed similar to Rebecca's taste. "So, Rebecca, no more games, please. Who are you and what's going on here?" I asked. She took another bite and another sip of wine before getting nervous. "First of all, thank you, Gregory. You could have handled what I did there differently, but you did it with absolute grace. I stood at your door for almost 20 minutes before I knocked." I nodded, sipping my wine. "As for who I am, we've met a couple times before. I'm Colleen's niece." She thought for a moment, and a light bulb went off in my head. "Ah, Rebecca, yes, I'm sorry, but you look very different than the last time we met," I replied. She smiled. There was sadness in her eyes, but it was old pain. I had indeed met Rebecca before, but she looked very different. At the time, she was in a goth phase, going after some boy who Colleen had told me was no good. When we first met, she had dyed her hair black, had several piercings in her nose and ears. She was wearing a ton of pale makeup and clothes and boots that would make any goth proud. I was coming out of a period of self-destruction, she told me, but she was also smiling. It was about a month after I broke up with my boyfriend. I hadn't realized who I was yet, and I was just lost. Aunt Colleen brought me to the office after talking to my mom to try and get a change of scenery. I nodded, taking another sip of wine, remembering the meeting as she described it. She'd come into the office about 5 times in a month, each time dressed in all black. As I recall, her now beautiful blonde hair was dyed black. She had black lipstick and eyeliner and piercings in several places on her face that were no longer there. He cheated on me with 3 people, 2 girls and a guy, she told me straight, bringing me out of my memories. I almost snorted from the wine I'd drunk. What? Said I incredulously. Yes, she said, looking into the wine and recalling the memories. We were at a club, and we went back to another guy's place. I went to the bathroom, and when I came back, I saw this. She threw me a brief glance and then returned her eyes to her wine glass. I was scared. I was and still am a single woman, she said, her eyes briefly finding mine. Me too, I said. I saw her relax a little. Anyway, Rebecca continued, I screamed and ran out of the house, practically ran home to Mom and Dad and cried for 3 days straight. After a week, Mom talked me into going for a walk with Aunt Colleen, and that's when she brought me to the office and I met you. I smiled. I remember when we met, she said, smiling tokenistically. Aunt Colleen introduced us and you shook my hand. You didn't look at me like I was a pathetic goth girl who had just been betrayed. You didn't lower your eyes at the way I was dressed or the rings on my face. Do you remember what you asked me? I nodded. I asked you what kind of coffee you wanted. Rebecca smiled. Yes. Mocha with a double shot of chocolate, we said at the same time. We both laughed. You remember, Rebecca smiled. I nodded and took another sip of wine. She lost the smile. The slap was because I was here at the barbecue that day and you didn't notice me, she told me, looking straight into my eyes. I'm sorry, Rebecca. It's been a rough day. I swallowed before answering. She gave me a token smile. It's okay, Gregory. I didn't mean for it to be a serious slap in the face. I know your head was elsewhere. I just mentally kissed you and then slapped you since you didn't notice me that day. I even managed to hug you that day and tell you everything was going to be okay. But I guess that's what everyone else was doing and you don't remember much of that day. I looked at her. I had an image of slender arms in front of me and a pair of dark blue jeans with a red blouse telling me everything was going to be okay. Do you remember? She asked, guessing my thoughts. Sort of, I admitted. Red top, blue jeans? Rebecca smiled and nodded. I was talking to Aunt Colleen the other day and asked about you. Rebecca blushed slightly. She's known for a long time that I have a bit of a crush on you, and I think she saw me hug you at the barbecue. So she encouraged me to reach out and come over and talk to you. I chuckled slightly. Did you know you were coming to kiss me? No, Rebecca blushed. Honestly, I didn't know if I could go through with it, but when you opened the door, I just ignored every impulse to run away and went for it. I smiled and took her hand. I'm glad you did. Honestly, it was the best thing that's happened to me in months. Rebecca smiled, and we spent the next 3 hours talking. She helped me clean up dinner, and then we continued our conversation over a small glass of port as we moved into my living room. I learned that she is 28, a little under 4 years younger than me, and just graduated from a finance university. She likes a wide variety of music, though she hates death metal after she stopped being a goth. Rebecca took a job as a junior accountant at a manufacturing firm, working in the accounts receivable department, and mostly enjoyed her work. She was close to her family. Her mom and dad had been married for 30 years, and she said she hoped they would live another 30. She had a younger sister who lived in New Zealand, but they only communicated once a month. Rebecca loved going to the beach, but she had sensitive skin, so she tried to stay out of the water. She had only had 2 boyfriends, including a goth who had betrayed her and was upset that she had given him her virginity. We spent that evening talking about ourselves. She learned that I had become estranged from my mother after family strife caused by my father's sudden death. I had a younger sister, but we didn't socialize with her as she was the cause of the family rift, taking Jillian's comment out of context. It was close to 1 o'clock in the morning when she left. I think we were both tempted to keep her, but she decided to tell me that we should get to know each other better first. Climbing into bed, I fell asleep with a smile on my face, for the first time since my life had fallen apart. Rebecca had bypassed months of trying to overcome my defenses and pain with her crazy actions. That kiss caught me off guard and showed me that someone could care about me in a romantic way, and that I was open to it. The next morning, the smile on my face was undeniable, and everyone noticed it. By lunchtime, Colleen had me cornered. Okay, spill it out, Greg. Who is she? Asked Colleen. I sensed hope in her facial expression. Rebecca came over last night, I told her. The joyous shriek that Colleen let out was heard throughout the office. My office administrator jumped a couple times, clasping her hands to her chest and letting out a megawatt smile. Colleen then took me into the kitchen and made me tell her everything. She laughed when I told her about the kiss and the slap. Then she happily swayed as I told her about dinner and talking until 1 o'clock in the morning. Greg, I'm so happy for you, even if nothing comes out of this. Seeing you pull out from under what Jillian and that asshole did to you is worth it. She then looked at me with a cheeky grin on her face. But you and Becca, I think there's something between you two. I've been thinking about it for a while. We talked for a few more minutes, and Colleen asked if I was going to see Rebecca again. I told her that we had been texting all day and were going to have dinner Friday night in town. She was immensely happy the rest of the day, and that was passed on to everyone else. Friday night came and I went to pick up Rebecca. I asked her to dress up a bit, as I wanted our first official date to be one that we would step up and make memorable. She didn't disappoint. I knocked on her apartment door and my breath caught again. Rebecca looked amazing. Wow, I'm batting for the ages so far, she laughed. Every time we meet, you can't even say hello. Hello, beautiful, I said. Menon, Rebecca said, closing her eyes. I laughed. She opened her eyes and smiled. We walked hand in hand to my car, and when I opened the door, Rebecca stopped and stared at me. Is this your car? She asked. Yeah, I said. Rebecca's jaw dropped. Yes, I'm a Mustang enthusiast. But not just any Mustang. I have a 1967 GT. It's classic gray with black racing stripes and classic trim, but with a modified exhaust. I'll be honest, I was surprised Jillian didn't try to get it in the divorce. But I guess she knew I would have killed her if she had tried. This car was my pride and joy, and only showed up for special occasions. I opened the passenger door for Rebecca. She lowered herself into the seat with a smile. When I started the car, Rebecca giggled and then laughed as the vibration of the V8 swept through the cabin. We drove into town, discussing our work weeks, how Colleen had talked to both of us, and that she had high hopes for us. We had dinner at an upscale Japanese restaurant. It served a variety of dishes, of which Rebecca and I tried several. Although I'm not much of a fan of the dish, we both tried a small amount of sake. Rebecca, like me, was convinced that sake was a fun drink for a date, but not for regular consumption. After dinner, we headed to the casino. We made a few bets and left with a little over $600 more than we had started with an hour before. There was also a club in the casino, so after getting dressed, we both headed in. It was an upscale club with a lot of people of different age groups, and everyone was dressed for a good night out. Several times throughout the evening, guys came up to her and asked her to dance. Like I said, she looked amazing, but each time she politely but firmly declined. One day, I was on my way back from the bar with a couple drinks for us when one guy stopped me by putting his hand on my shoulder. You're a lucky son of a bitch. I hope you know that. He said to me and then saw my blank expression. Your woman is a man. She's hot, but only has eyes for you. No offense, but I just asked her to dance while you were at the bar, but she flat out turned me down. I mean me turned down. The guy was sturdy and good-looking. Probably a personal trainer, football player or something. I got the impression he knew how to turn on the charm and had probably seduced more than one girlfriend or wife over the years, taking them away from their better half. But Rebecca had turned him down, and he knew there was no more chance. The guy patted me on the shoulder, smiled, and walked on. Saturday morning, I woke up slowly, smiling as I remembered the night Rebecca and I had spent together. We didn't get out of bed that weekend, only to take a bath or fetch food from the kitchen when it was time to go to work. I had to drive Rebecca back to her apartment in the dress she wore Friday night. By the time I got to the office, I had 2 more pictures of my girlfriend. In the second one, she took a pen and wrote Gregory's. Rebecca stayed with me every night that week, except Wednesday, when she had to work late in the office, and it was easier for her to get things from her place. Next chapter. Hey, Greg, James said one Tuesday after going out for coffee. Do you have a few minutes? He said, without waiting for an answer, and closed the door. Sure, I said in response, raising an eyebrow and gesturing for him to close the door. I sensed that he wanted to talk about something serious, and I guessed from the look on his face that it had to do with Jillian. So you and Rebecca are doing well? He asked. Yeah, I grinned. It's only been a few months, but I feel like we've been together for 6. I realize Sherry and I have been together for just under 5 years, but it feels like it's been 10. James looked at me worriedly for a moment. Yeah, but not in a bad way. I mean, I can't. I held up my hand and grinned. I understand, James, I do. It's not a bad thing. He nodded. Sherry and I are so happy to see a smile on your face again. By the way, we were wondering if you both would like to have dinner Saturday night at our house. There was something else in that. A nervousness based on hope. I don't think we have any plans, but I'll double check with Becky. He nodded. Um, Greg, said James, moving on to the topic he'd closed the door for. I sighed. Jillian? I asked. Sort of, James said. Do you know about the Kensington check we're doing? He asked. I answered and nodded my head. Of the two large multinationals we had taken on, Kensington was one of them. James was in second place studying the financial statements. Dad, we've run into a couple problems and I need some instructions, he said to me. Okay, show me what you have, I told him. James laid out some reports, but in addition to a number of problems, they indicated that one of their middle managers seemed to be ripping off the company and using the money to pay for a number of not-so-desirable services, from prostitutes to sending money to a mistress and child in the United States. Judging from the audit log, this had been going on for several years, but had not come under scrutiny because the man was quite clever, hiding savings on different cost centers and projects, never for the same amount, never from the same purchase order, and with payments to different bank accounts. However, because of the length of the case, it totaled just under $2 million. I sat there trying to make sense of it all. I was literally blown away by the implications. So, let me get this straight, I said to James. For a little over 4 years, he's been ripping off the company to pay for prostitutes. And for the last 3 years, it looks like he's been paying child support out of company money to a woman and child overseas. James nodded. Quite. Wow, I tried not to smile. So much for true love, James snorted. A month later, we gave Kensington the first report, but withheld details until the file tracking was complete. They were concerned that someone might be cheating them and agreed that they needed to know how deep the corruption went before taking action. We asked for another month of time, and they readily agreed. 2 weeks after that, on Friday night, when I returned home, I found that Becca had already let me in and had arranged a candlelight dinner. She poured me a Kraken and a Coke and herself a glass of red. While we dined on chicken Bos Kailoa, I eyed the box that stood between us. It didn't take center stage in the conversation, but Rebecca knew I was thinking about it. As we cleaned up and refilled our drinks, heading into the living room, Rebecca had already dimmed the lights and turned on some quiet music through the Bluetooth speaker. Greg, babe, I just want to say that the last 6 months have been the best 6 months of my entire life. She told me. I wanted to answer her back in the same way, but she held up her hand. Sorry, I just want to say that. She smiled. I know you were broken when we got together, but in a way I was broken too. As you know, I had some strange experiences in my early love life, and ours is much better than anything I can imagine. But that's because we give ourselves completely to each other. I love spending time with you, and I can't wait until the end of the workday to come home to you. I told you that I've been in love with you since the day we met in your office, and it's true. But I am in love with you, Gregory the other. I really need you to know that when you open the box. With those words, Rebecca set her glass aside and handed me the box that had been on the kitchen table during dinner and was now on the floor in front of us. She held it out to me, but she didn't lift her glass, just looked at me expectantly. The box itself was small, about the same size as shipping a pair of headphones from Amazon. It wasn't sealed, and I carefully removed the lid to discover another box inside, but it had an envelope on it. I picked up the envelope and looked at Rebecca. She looked at me nervously, but nodded as I unfolded the letter inside. Gregory, in this box is the engagement ring you bought last week. I accidentally found it last weekend when I was cleaning and you were in the shower. I really, really hope you open the box, take out the ring, and ask me to marry you. I love you so much. Sincerely and forever, Rebecca Brown. P.S. Love you, love you, love you. I looked again at Rebecca, who had hope written all over her face, and muttered to her, I love you too, as I opened the second box, and there, amongst a pile of tissue paper, lay the box I had bought with the engagement ring. Inside was a simple gold ring with a single diamond in a claw setting in the middle. I smiled at Rebecca, removing the ring box. I never looked in the ring box, baby, Rebecca told me. I wanted to, but I didn't. I nodded, then got up from the couch and knelt down in front of her. Even though Rebecca had organized this week's earlier than I had planned, she sighed, but smiled. Rebecca Brown, from the moment you showed up at my door, you have haunted me. You brought me to life and made me feel alive again. Before you kissed me that first time, I didn't think I'd ever see the sun again. When we first woke up together, you amazed me with your willingness to not only pursue, but to show me how much you wanted to be mine. In all the world, I couldn't imagine a more beautiful woman or a more perfect partner. You always surprise me by pushing my boundaries but never disappoint. I was planning on doing this in a couple weeks at your family barbecue. However, I don't think either of us can miss this moment. I opened the ring box. Rebecca Beth Brown, will you honor me by becoming my wife and agreeing to marry me? I finished. The words barely had time to leave my lips before she jumped to her knees in front of me and shouted, Yes! She held out her hand and I slipped the wedding ring onto her ring finger, whereupon she kissed me. Thank you, my fiancé, I told her. You're going to have the most caring wife in the world, and wait until we have kids. I can't wait for you to knock me up and leave me barefoot and pregnant. Rebecca knew this was going to turn me on. She knew about Jillian and I talking about babies. A minute later, the doorbell rang, and I groaned as I had to separate from the woman I had just proposed to in order to answer the phone, rather than drag her into bed. Opening the door, I was surprised to find Colleen, Rebecca's parents, James, and Sherry. Congratulations! They all shouted together as I opened the door and gasped in surprise. I felt a pair of arms wrap around my waist. Sorry, babe. I wanted to celebrate our engagement, so I invited a few people over. Last surprise for the night, I promise, my bride-to-be told me. We ushered everyone inside, and her parents brought 2 bottles of champagne with them. As they handed over the glasses, I tried to feign offense since I had no idea, but I couldn't help but smile. While Rebecca showed the ring to the ladies, I received slaps on the back from my future father-in-law and James. We then sat down as a group and spent the rest of the evening laughing merrily at stories about Rebecca and I's childhood. Later that evening and early in the morning when everyone had left, Rebecca and I headed to bed. But before she went to sleep, she made me take a few more pictures of her engagement ring. However, in those pictures and even in the video that no one else will ever see, the engagement ring was the only thing she was wearing. In keeping with the fact that I sometimes have one drama in my life, about a month later, 3 events happened within 48 hours of each other. The first was that we delivered the completed forensic report to Kensington. When we read the report, they were not happy at all. Heads would roll, and the authorities would probably have to be contacted. I tried not to get too excited when handing over the report. The Kensington management didn't know I had anything against the main participant in the fraud. The second thing happened the same day. Rebecca took time off work and came to my office with documents, wedding ideas, and just to please all the staff. It was while reading the legal documents she placed in front of me that I first became angry with my bride-to-be. Becca, you've got to be kidding me with this document, I told her, getting more and more upset as I read. Well, baby, it should bring you a lot of peace of mind about our upcoming marriage. You'll be protected, your home, your business, everything. I know, Becca, but it's not fair to you. This prenup leaves you with almost nothing. No, it doesn't. It only leaves me with nothing if I cheat on you, which I will never do, she replied. In all other cases, the marital estate is split in half, and your business and trusts remain safe. Becca, baby, I said. I know you're just trying to show me how much you love me because of what Jillian did to me, but the protections I already have are enough. Rebecca held up a hand. I know, Greg. Believe me, I know, she told me, holding my hands. But this is my promise to you. I will only walk away with nothing if I cheat on you. Like I told you before, that will never happen. I took the pen and signed the document. I will trust you, Becca. I know, baby. Trust me, we'll put this in a drawer and never need it. We spent the rest of the day discussing this document several times. In the end, however, she was right, and the document went to the file cabinet drawer to collect dust. The third incident occurred the next evening at home. I had just gotten home, and Rebecca, who had moved in permanently, sent me to the shower. I was just coming out of it when I heard screaming. Throwing on my shorts, I hurried toward the exit. So I move out, and he moves in with some smeared horror. I heard my ex-wife yelling at my fiancé. I heard Rebecca's laughter. Honey, you just walked out the door. You left the most loving and kindest man on this planet, breaking his heart. And I'm not wearing makeup, Rebecca replied, using her fingers for quotation marks. I lingered in the hallway to avoid catching her eye. But slut! Yes, I agree with that. However, I am Gregory's personal whore. He receives my body gratuitously for his exclusive use. Can you say the same when you were married to him? My fiancé hissed back at Jillian. Why, you little goddamn whore. I heard Jillian shout, And a moment later, there was the resounding sound of a slap. I took that as my cue, hurrying the rest of the way into the room. Both women turned to me as one, though Jillian stood, covering the red stain on her cheek with her hand. I chuckled. Rebecca, I said with a smile on my face. Meet Jillian, my ex-wife. Jillian, meet Rebecca, my fiancée. Both women stared at each other and then separated as I stepped between them. Do you find this amusing, Greg? Asked Jillian to me. Actually, I said, pausing. Yeah, since you weren't invited and started yelling at my fiancé before you got slapped, I find it funny. Perhaps it's a little karma for the way our previous life together ended. Rebecca grinned at Jillian then, but I held out my hand. That's enough, Becca. She stepped back, continuing to stare at my ex. What do you want, Jillian? I said, sighing. Why did you do it, Greg? Why did you have to ruin my life? She asked, turning some of her anger on me. What do you mean, Jillian? I replied innocently. I've had nothing to do with you for almost a year now. As far as I can remember, you're the one who tried to ruin my life. You left me for true love, and damned the consequences. Behind me, Rebecca snorted. Jillian threw an angry glance at Rebecca, then at me. You didn't have to go off and destroy Troy, she said, with a mournful note in her voice. I laughed, causing Jillian to go slightly pale. You're going to have to be a little more specific, Jillian, I told her, crossing my arms over my chest. Rebecca automatically put her arm around my shoulders. It was other accounting that did the forensic audit of Kensington. It was your report that got Troy arrested. You didn't have to do that, said Jillian, her voice softer. What? I shouldn't report to the company I'm auditing that one of its employees defrauded them of just over $2 million that was spent on prostitutes and a woman and child in the United States? I asked my ex-wife rhetorically. Prostitutes? Said Jillian, turning white. A woman and a child? Obviously, whatever truth Jillian had been told, it lacked substantial detail. I leaned forward. Yes, Jillian. The true love you left me for has a woman and child in the States. On top of that, he stole company money to pay for it. It's all in the report. I can send it to you if you'd like. She sank to the ground, and the world around her collapsed. For the first time since this all started, I saw that she was lost. Everything she had told herself about her life was crumbling. Rebecca and I watched as she slumped to the ground on the porch. He got arrested, you know, Jillian told us, the anger from before gone, and the grief in her voice now sounded hollow. I didn't know Troy had been arrested, but I suspected the authorities wouldn't want to talk to him anytime soon. We've been married less than 3 months, and he spent a month of that in the States, Jillian told us. As we watched, Jillian began to sob. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel sorry for her. After all, I'd been married to her for years. I'd hugged her body in a fit of passion. We'd talked for hours and shared dreams. Yes, I sympathized with her, but at the same time she was also my tormentor. Cruelly and heartlessly, without a second thought, she discarded me. I'm a kind man. But when it came to Jillian, I couldn't be so kind anymore. What should I do, Greg? Asked Jillian, looking at Rebecca and me. Rebecca answered for me. You have the guts to ask him that after what you did to him, Rebecca said firmly, but surprisingly without venom. Some of the fire returned to Jillian. He was mine long before he was yours, Jillian replied. Rebecca laughed and hugged me tightly again. He was never truly yours, Jillian. You never really let him into your heart. You never gave yourself to him 100%. You must have always kept a part of yourself away from him to do what you did to him. That's not true, Jillian protested, shaking her head and looking at me. I just stood as still as a statue, watching the conversation unfold. I gave myself completely to Greg when we got married. Rebecca laughed. Of course you did. That's why, as soon as your true love returned, you started sleeping with him behind your husband's back. That's why you humiliated him in front of a group of people and tried to take away his house, investments, and even his business. Isn't that right? I mean, that's giving yourself completely to Greg. For a moment, Jillian was silent. If a person could become transparent and disappear, I had a feeling it was happening right in front of our eyes. It finally came to me what Jillian had done, what she had given up. Rebecca's hands left my side, and she came over and sat down next to Jillian, showing surprising compassion. Jillian, Rebecca said softly, you don't know my story. When I first met Greg, I wasn't at my best. He was happily married to you at the time, and I realized how much he loved you from the brief conversations I had with him. As time went on, I learned more about him, and I have to admit I was jealous of you. Jillian looked up, a look of surprise on her face. Rebecca continued, and I leaned against the doorway, crossing my arms over my chest. When I heard what you did to him, I was furious. Jillian nodded slowly. She lowered her head, staring at the concrete of the porch. But then, Rebecca said, looking up at me and smiling, I was at a barbecue for Greg that weekend when the divorce between the two of you became final. Jillian looked up at me, something akin to pain reflected in her eyes. I remained calm, wondering where Rebecca would take the conversation. He was in a daze. Even Aunt Colleen had a hard time getting through to him. Jillian glanced quickly at Rebecca, startled by such a revelation. Rebecca continued, Yes, Colleen is my aunt. Anyway, Greg was broken. You left him, ruined your marriage, and he was in danger of sinking into depression or worse. Gone was the kind and gentle man who comforted me a couple years ago. My heart broke for him. Both women looked at me, Rebecca with adoration, Jillian with sorrow. Throughout the evening, although Greg didn't see it, everyone spent time comforting him. He cried openly in front of all of us, not hiding his pain from what you had done to him. He was vulnerable. I think almost everyone at the barbecue hugged him that night, including me. Rebecca smiled at me again. Jillian pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around her legs, continuing to look at me while Rebecca told her story. After I hugged Greg, he doesn't remember it, but he told me thank you. In that moment, I realized I could help him. I knew I had a chance to stop his slide into bitterness. I knew that the spark of desire in my own heart to give myself to Greg could be laid in the ruins of what you left behind. For a moment, no one said anything. The next week I came here, and when he opened the door, Rebecca said, a smirk on her face that mirrored my own, I kissed him. Then I slapped him. Jillian's eyes widened, and she looked at Rebecca, then at me, and Rebecca and I smiled at each other as we recalled the memory. It was like that, Jillian, Rebecca continued her story. From that moment on, I belong to him entirely. There will never be another man in my heart, another person I will love as much as Greg. Just thinking about what you did to him makes me physically sick. You threw away a man who could have given you the whole world, and for that alone, I thank you. My heart and soul belong to him now, and if you hadn't thrown him away, I never would have had a chance. Again, no one said anything. Each of us immersed in our own thoughts, pondering how he had gotten to this point. What am I supposed to do now? She asked. I gave up everything for a dream. Rebecca shrugged. Honestly, I don't care what you do. Jillian looked at her in surprise. I'm just letting you know that you've let things out of your hands, and that under no circumstances will I allow you back into my man's life. He's mine, and if you try anything, well, I don't think you want to find out how crazy I might be if someone were to infringe on my happiness. Rebecca stood up and walked over to me. I found my voice. Jillian. My ex looked at me, flabbergasted. Rebecca is right. She belongs to me, and I belong to her entirely. We will get married, have children, and hopefully love until the day we die. Becca is also right about love. For my part, I don't love you anymore. I remember that I once loved you, but after your betrayal and Becca coming into my life, there is no love left in me for you. If Jillian could look any more broken, I don't know what she'd look like. And to be honest, I said, I don't really like you. You've hurt me in a way that no one has before and no one else will ever again. But I have a memory of love, so I'll give you some advice. Jillian looked up at me. Divorce Troy, I said. Leave him now before the shit hits the fan. He'll go to jail for a long time for what he did. Where am I going to go? She asked. I shrugged. I don't care. Maybe Mark and Lena will let you stay with them. They're getting a divorce, Jillian said sadly. I snorted. Not really surprised. As you know, a cheating spouse will do that to you. Look, Jillian, you have to figure this out for yourself. I'm not going to be there for you. I'm not your friend. We're just two people who had something. Is that really how you feel? That we have no chance of being friends? Asked Jillian hopefully. No, Rebecca and I answered in unison. With those words, Jillian stood up and shook her head sadly. She looked at Rebecca and I standing hand in hand. Jillian sighed. Thank you for your honesty. I really wish we could still be friends. I had hoped for that at the beginning of all this, but now I see it was all a dream. She stopped again and shook her head. Thank you. No one else has been honest with me. Take care of each other. I hope you have a happy life together. With those words, she walked to her car, got in, gave us both a mournful look, and drove away. Over the next month, more and more details about Troy's arrest appeared in the press. Our audit that uncovered the fraud was in the news, and eventually, by the end of the year, we had to nearly double our staff due to the demand for our services. Rebecca and I were married in a small ceremony among friends and family. We went on our honeymoon to North Queensland, spending a luxurious 2 weeks on the golden beaches of the Sunshine State. When we returned, we got into a rhythm of work, lovemaking, and dreaming of the future. We started talking about kids. Rebecca agreed that she wouldn't take birth control, and we would see what would happen. 9 months later, Sarah was born. Just under 2 years after that came twins Henry and Peter, and last born was our baby girl Bridget. After Bridget was born, Rebecca and I decided that 4 was enough, and I went in for surgery. In the years that followed, our lives were rich and fruitful in ways I could never have imagined. Sure, we had the usual family problems, quarrels, and the like, but there was a lot of love in our home, and it never waned over the years. The epilogue is 32 years later. It was a crisp winter morning when the kids and I laid Rebecca to rest. Her battle with cancer had only lasted 2 years. Until the very end, Rebecca gave the kids and me everything she had. Even in her weakened state, we often lay together as husband and wife, and Rebecca told me she needed to feel her husband's love. Baby, Rebecca said in pain, but even under the influence of the medication remaining alert. We snuggled together on the bed. You're going to be okay, you know that. I'm not going to leave you alone. I snorted. I know we'll only be apart for a few years before I come to find you, I told her, stroking her now graying blonde hair. Rebecca smiled. Like Canada, then? We both smiled, remembering how I had gotten stuck in a blizzard just an hour away from the cabin where Rebecca was waiting for me. For nearly 3 weeks, we'd only communicated via FaceTime. Well, yeah, I replied, and we both smiled. Are you going to miss me? She asked. I snorted again. As if you need to ask, you know I'll miss you with all my soul, I replied. We lay together and words were not needed. After a while, she grabbed my hand, clenching her fists. I'm scared, baby, Rebecca told me. She was crying quietly. I know there's not much time left. I can feel my body shutting down. Her tears hit my chest. At the same time, I felt myself pulling away from her. Married for over 30 years, 4 children, 6 grandchildren, and another on the way. Traveled the world together. And now this, I whispered. I'll be here the whole time. I'm not going anywhere. I know, Rebecca replied. It's the only thing that gives me strength. The next day, the children came with their families, and we all sat with Rebecca. She was much weaker than yesterday, and we could all tell she was about to pass away as her skin changed color from pink to orange and then lost color altogether. Throughout the day, we reminisced and laughed at the stories. We cried and even sang songs in those final hours. The kids said goodbye and stood around the bed, and I sat down and hugged my wife. I love you, I told her, feeling that our time together would only last a few minutes. I felt tears come to my eyes. And I love you, she said weakly. Her eyes began to dim. In front of us were Rebecca's last moments in this world. Her fragile hand reached up and lightly slapped my cheek, reminding me of our first day together. We smiled and she reached for my shirt, pulling me to her as I leaned in and kissed her. Suddenly, all the previous years seemed to vanish into thin air. In my arms, like my bride in her first kiss, not a wrinkle on her face, not a cancer eating away at her body. We were young and vibrant. Her eyes were bright, and the love she had for me almost overwhelmed me. I froze in place, snuggled against her, closing my eyes and feeling my tears stain the sheets as she walked away. I cried, feeling like a part of myself was lost forever. My family surrounded me, and we cried openly and loudly. Rebecca, my wife, the mother of all my 4 children, was my true love, my soulmate, and I knew I would never be the same without her in my life. But I was also happy. She was no longer in pain from the ravages of cancer on her body. After that, I knew that even if she wasn't with me, I would have daily reminders of our life together. We had our children, and almost every weekend one of them would be by my side, or I would visit them. James and Sherry and their brood were often around too. No one let me be lonely. As the months passed after Rebecca's death, I rejoiced in my family, rejoiced in my friends. At night, if I was lonely, I had so many pictures and videos of our time together that I always went to bed with a smile. Often, after her release in earlier years, I would picture her next to me, content that we loved each other, and that someday we would be together again. About 6 months after Rebecca's death, I was enjoying coffee on a Saturday morning at our local coffee shop when some shadow swept over me and stopped abruptly. Gregory? Spoke a voice I hadn't heard in over 30 years. Jillian, I replied, recognizing her as an older version of the woman I once loved. I don't know why, but I gestured to a seat on the other side of the table. Would you care to join me? I asked. She hesitated for a moment before nodding her head and sitting down. As I studied her sitting down, I noted the wrinkles on her face, the gaunt look, the freckles on her arms, and her relatively lean body. I hadn't followed her life too closely since that evening on my front porch, but from what I knew, it hadn't been easy. "How are you doing?" I asked conversationally. "Oh, as I get older, my body doesn't react the way it used to. When I try to get up in the morning, I wonder if I should just lie in bed. That way it won't hurt as much," she told me. I laughed. I could understand that. Jillian smiled, but then got a little bit sadder. "I heard that Rebecca died." "I'm sorry, Greg," she said with genuine regret, which surprised me. "Thank you," I said to my ex-wife. "I miss her terribly, but she's always in my heart and still in my sight every day," I replied, smiling as I remembered how Rebecca and I had sat at this very table several times over the years. "And," I said, sighing, "the kids don't give me a moment's peace. Now that Becky's gone, they're determined to make sure I'm always active and that someone looks after their aging father." Jillian smiled for a moment, then lost the smile again and just looked sad. "Do you have kids?" I asked. She shook her head, looking down at her coffee with great regret. "I've never had children," Jillian told me. "I was married 6 times before I realized that nothing compared to what I had with my first boyfriend." There was a bitter note in her smile. "I really blew it, didn't I, Greg?" she asked, and then held up her hand. "No, I know you did. I hurt you badly and then compounded my mistake by spending a lot of time blaming you for Troy, tricking me into believing we were soulmates. Every man since then, every time I got married, I thought this is it, and every time he just wasn't a match for you." I reflected on the woman standing in front of me. To be honest, I'd hated her for a long time, longer than I'd been mad at her. But now I saw a broken, sad woman who had never been in a real relationship, not one where there was enough love or trust to produce a child. "Jillian," I said, catching my breath, and she looked at me with the same hope in her eyes that I'd seen all those years ago. "I think you need to forgive yourself. 6 marriages? They must not have all been as bad as Troy's. Surely a couple of them were okay." For a moment her eyes lost focus. A memory flashed through my mind that I couldn't see. "You're right, Barry. My 4th husband was a kind and gentle man. And you're also right. After that night with you and Rebecca, I never forgave myself for what I did to you. I wanted to be loved, but I never got over the pain I caused you." She looked at me. "I know I've said this before, but I'm sorry for what I did to you, Greg," Jillian told me softly. "Thank you, Jillian. I accept your apology," I replied, about to let her go. We both smiled. We spent the next few hours talking. I told her about my and Rebecca's life, the kids in our lives. Jillian told me about her hobbies and some of the activities she was doing these days as she retired after working for over 25 years for the local government in an administrative position. "Greg, you don't think that—" she asked uncertainly as we got up from the table to go our separate ways. I smiled and shook my head. "No, I'm sorry, Jillian. I love my wife too much." "Greg, I know you loved Rebecca, but she's gone. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that." I held up my hand. "Jillian, Becca and I were only separated for a short time until we are reunited again. My love for her burns as brightly today as it did the day we met. I cannot and will not cheat on my wife," I told her. My words hit something deep inside my ex-wife, a real pain and realization of what she had lost. She nodded slowly. "Friends, then?" she asked. "We'll see, Jillian, we'll see," I replied. I managed to hold on for another decade until a stroke took me away Saturday afternoon. Sarah and Bridget were nearby, and we were just having lunch when I sat down to watch TV. I was surprised that I wasn't in pain. My vision blurred. I felt very tired, and then I closed my eyes. The next moment I felt a pair of arms around my waist, and I realized I was standing next to my body, and Rebecca was hugging me. "Becca?" I asked. "It's okay, baby, it's your time," she told me. "The kids?" I asked. "It's going to be okay," she told me. "You haven't noticed how much you've slowed down in the last month, but they have. They're ready." I nodded. "This is real, isn't it? It's not just my dying brain's imagination?" I asked my wife. She laughed, pulled me to her, and kissed me. "If it is, what a way to go. Kissing your wife until your last breath." I smiled. "But no, it's real here. Look, the girls are coming," said Rebecca to me. For the next hour we stood and watched my family gather around and cry. But I noticed the laughter too. My children were telling stories about Rebecca and me growing up. They laughed and cried in equal measure. Rebecca and I stood and watched with our arms wrapped tightly around each other, proud that our family was strong and would make it through the future without us. When the paramedics arrived and took my body away, Rebecca and I took turns hugging and kissing the kids. We knew it would be a long time before we saw them again. They didn't notice us, just a slight movement of air. "Come on, baby," Rebecca said, wiping tears from her eyes. "I have a lot to show you. You're going to love it. We have so much love to make up for." "Don't I have to go to God or something?" I asked. "Well, yeah, he's waiting for you. But don't worry, he's a good guy." She smiled. I stopped for a moment and looked Rebecca over from head to toe. Her body looked the same as it did before we conceived Sarah. However, my body looked about the same too. "Wait, there's entertainment in heaven?" I asked. Rebecca smiled. Rebecca looked at me with blazing eyes, grabbed my hand and pulled me in a certain direction. "Come and find out my true love," she told me, and there was sensuality in her voice. "Come and find out." The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.